Welcome back, everyone, to today's Explainer. I am super excited to take you on a little investigative journey into a fascinating, yet heavily debated chapter in the history of Gujarat and the Saurashtra region. We're going to dive deep into the historical records and the rich local folklore to unpack the story of a man whose name still echoes through the hills of Western India. Let's get right into it and explore the rebel legend of Kadu Makrani.
So have you ever heard of a guy who is somehow, at the exact same time, revered as a passionate freedom fighter and totally feared as a dangerous, ruthless bandit? It's kind of a wild contradiction, right? Hero or criminal? I want you to keep this question in the back of your mind as we go through this. How does one single person end up with two completely different legacies?
All right, Section 1. Hero or criminal? The Makrani mystery.
Okay. Let's dive into this by grounding the legend in some actual historical fact. The man immortalized in all this local folklore as Kadu Makrani, well, his real name was Khadra Baksh Rind Baloch. It's so important when we look at these larger-than-life historical figures to kind of peel back the myth for a second and just start with the raw facts, you know? Once we recognize his real identity, we can actually start tracing his footsteps through the landscape of 19th century India.
Moving on to Section 2, the Makrani struggle and the origins of a rebel.
Let's trace how all this tension built up over time. If we look way back, his ancestors actually migrated from the Makran region of Balochistan all the way down to Gujarat. And that's exactly why his family and his broader community just became known locally as the Makranis. Then, fast forward a bit to 1831, which is roughly the year Kadu Baksh was born into this community over in the Junagadh region. And as he grew up throughout the 19th century, he was living in an era that was totally defined by the British rapidly expanding and tightening their grip across the subcontinent.
And what did that expanding British influence actually look like on the ground for the average person? Honestly, it was brutal. British power was spreading like wildfire, subjugating local princely states like Junagadh. And with that major loss of local autonomy came these back-breaking taxes imposed on the poor, plus some incredibly strict, unfamiliar laws enforced on everyday commoners. Basically, it was a massive pressure cooker, and the ordinary people of Gujarat were absolutely feeling the intense heat of these oppressive conditions.
Which brings us to Section 3, Rebellion against the British, and a major breaking point.
So the big question is, what exactly pushed him over the edge? Well, there were a few specific triggers that all kind of crashed together. First off, there was this deep sense of unfair administrative treatment directed at his family and the wider Makrani community. You combine that with intense, localized land disputes with the Junagadh state, and you've got a literal recipe for an explosion. For Kadu, this wasn't just some abstract political theory, this was highly personal. His community's livelihood, their dignity, it was all under direct threat, and that turned personal grievances into just fierce, open defiance.
And you can see this strategic shift play out in three very distinct steps. Number 1, he didn't just protest, he literally picked up arms. Number 2, realizing he couldn't exactly fight a conventional war against a massive state army, he and his comrades fell back into the rugged forests and hills of Saurashtra. And number 3, from those hidden vantage points, he launched active, highly calculated campaigns against the administration. He basically became a master of guerrilla tactics, using that unforgiving terrain to his absolute advantage.
By the time we hit the 1880s, the sheer scale of his rebellion was just impossible to ignore. Kadu Makrani was orchestrating these highly targeted attacks on government posts, wealthy landlords, and key administrative bases. He wasn't just out there causing random chaos, right? He was systematically striking at the very pillars of British and Junagadh authority. And let me tell you, this relentless campaign genuinely terrified the establishment.
That leads us right into Section 4, two different perspectives. Was he a hero or a villain?
This is where we see a super jarring contrast. On one side, you have the local folklore, the stories passed down by word of mouth through generations. To those folks, he was basically a Robin Hood figure, a savior, a protector of the poor who is brave, just, and fighting against rampant injustice. But on the flip side, if you look at the black and white ink of the official administrative records, they completely label him as a dangerous criminal, a violent looter, and a murderer. So we're essentially looking at a legendary freedom fighter on one hand and a violent terrorist on the other. This massive discrepancy is exactly why historians still passionately debate his true legacy even today.
All right, Section 5, Arrest and Execution, and the Inevitable End.
For years, Kadu was practically a ghost in the hills. I mean, he successfully dodged these massive, highly coordinated joint police campaigns launched by both the British forces and the Junagadh state. It was an intense, exhausting manhunt that dragged on for years. But no one can run forever. Despite his total mastery of the terrain and his massive local support network, the walls finally closed in, and his years on the run came to a definitive end with his capture.
Once they actually had him in custody, the state brought the absolute full weight of its legal system crashing down on him. The formal charges were incredibly severe. He was charged with murder, dacoity, which, if you aren't familiar, is basically armed robbery by a gang, and armed rebellion against the state. These definitely weren't minor infractions. These were heavy, capital offenses designed to seal his fate and, frankly, to send a crystal-clear message to anyone else even thinking about resistance.
Following his trial, the inevitable sentence was handed down. On this exact date, June 5, 1887, Kadu Baksh Baluch, known to history as Kadu Makrani, was executed by hanging. Now that date marked the abrupt, physical end of his rebellion. The man himself was gone, but as we're about to see, his legend? It was really only just beginning.
So let's look at Section 6, a complex legacy and how we remember Kadu today.
When we try to piece this all together today, his legacy is, well, it's incredibly tangled. Some people remember him strictly as a brave rebel who actually dared to stand up to the mighty British Empire. Others hold him up as a local hero, a guy who fought systemic injustice on behalf of the common folk. And yet, historians remind us that he remains a deeply controversial figure, forever tied to acts of violence and crime in the official archives. He just absolutely refuses to fit neatly into a single box.
And I think that brilliantly illustrates our core takeaway for today's explainer. History is rarely just black or white. To truly understand a historical character, we must read both folklore and official documents. If we only read the police reports, we just see a monster. But if we only listen to the folk songs, we see a saint. The real truth of Kadu Makrani, like so many complex historical figures really, exists somewhere in that messy gray area in between those two extremes.
So I want to leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought. How much of the history we know is simply shaped by the person telling the story? Kind of makes you rethink everything you ever read in a history textbook, doesn't it? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive today. If you enjoyed this structured breakdown, please make sure to like this explainer and subscribe so you never miss our next topic. And hey, jump into the comments, let me know what historical mystery do you want us to analyze and explain next. Until then, keep questioning the story.